We hope you've been enjoying the Limitless Leadership Lounge. This is where we have tri-generational conversations for you, the young and emerging leader. Thanks so much for joining us today, whatever you're up to. I'm John Gehring, host of the Limitless Leadership Lounge, alongside Coach Jim Johnson, who continues to bring us fantastic guests week after week. So we appreciate that, Coach. And today you brought on Joe Schmit, and we're really excited to talk with Joe today. So, Coach, go ahead and take it away and introduce our guest.
Yeah, it's a real honor because not only is Joe a terrific man, and I'll share his bio in a minute, but I also call him friend. We met a number of years ago at the National Speakers Association, and we talk quite a bit. We've become pretty good friends, and I admire Joe for all he's done, both professionally and with his family. So I'm going to share a short bio and welcome Joe to the show, and then we'll get right started to help our listeners, because Joe's got a lot of great knowledge and stories to share with us today. So our guest today is a man who's had the front row seat at some of the greatest sports events in history. He has interviewed the biggest names, covered the biggest events, and turned in some of the biggest expense accounts in TV history. Joe has been the sports director at KSTP TV in Minnesota since 1985. He has won 18 Emmys from the National Association of Television Arts and is also a 2019 inductee into the Minnesota Speakers Hall of Fame. He has written two wonderful books that I have had the pleasure to read, both of them, called Silent Impact and The Impact Blueprint. Also, Joe has been married to his wife, Laura, for 34 years. They have 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, and 3 grandchildren, with a new addition most recently. So, Joe, it's wonderful to have my friend on the show. Welcome to the Limitless Leadership Lounge.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you for what you do. I admire what you do, not only as a coach in the past, but that you're still out there making an impact today. And let's get more people on the bandwagon to lead a life of impact.
Awesome. So I know you've done that, and we're going to delve right into it. So I know you've interviewed all kinds of illustrious, people in the sports world and outside the sports world as well. But there's one that you wrote about in your books that I know. In fact, I know you just did a charity event recently with him, and that's the great Joe Mauer. That was a catcher and first baseman, and had won a batting title with the Minnesota Twins and had a wonderful career. But you've gotten to know Joe Mauer pretty well. So my question is 2-part. Can you share a story of impact with Joe Mauer, and maybe a leadership lesson or two you've learned from this great athlete that I believe also is a great role model?
Well, there's no question about it. I covered Joe in high school. That's how long I've been around. And Joe was simply the best high school athlete the state of Minnesota has ever produced. He signed with Florida State to be their starting quarterback. He was an all-state guard in basketball, led his team to the state basketball championship. And in baseball, that was his best sport. He was the very #1 pick in the amateur baseball draft, and the Minnesota Twins, the hometown team, just happened to have that pick. Joe, of course, went on to play 15 years. He had his number retired. He's going to be in the Baseball Hall of Fame. This is his first year coming up of eligibility. So, 3-time batting champ, 1-time MVP, Gold Gloves, you name it. Yeah, and Joe's really done it. But Joe's a Hall of Fame person too, and basically because he gets kindness, and that's what it's all about. So I share a story often when I'm doing presentations and in my book about how Joe, when he was a senior at Cretin-Derham Hall High School in St. Paul, would walk a student who was blind to the lunchroom, arm in arm, and would invite him to sit down at his table in the lunchroom. The kid's name was Mike, and Mike normally sat alone at lunch. So as a reporter, I thought, this had to have an impact. I study people who make an impact. My first book is Silent Impact, and my tagline kind of is, we make our biggest impressions when we're not trying to be impressive. Well, that's exactly what Joe did in this situation. So I found Mike Halley, and I found 6 guys who sat around that table every day. And we talked about the impact that it had back then and the impact it's still having today. And it's a really powerful story. And I don't know how far you want me to go on this, Jim, or not, because it's still going on.
Well,
It's still going.
it's a wonderful story, but I guess would you share your listeners, because obviously very profound and very powerful story, but what can we garner out of the real powerful leadership lessons that Joe exemplified there?
Well, I think number one is compassion. And I think today, maybe not as bad as it was 5-10 years ago, when young students come out of business school, they learned the X's and O's. They learned how to put together a great business plan, a strategy, budgets, line items, profit and loss statements, all these things. But what they really haven't thought about is how do you create a culture around that business plan that's going to make it successful. And you can't do it today without compassion. Joe was showing compassion, and because of that, it had a great impact on other people. And that's the way it works out. Joe was also a compassionate leader in the clubhouse. He was the kind of guy who would, a rookie would be struggling. He'd take him out to dinner, take him out to lunch. He would be the kind of guy that would sign autographs when nobody else was signing autographs. I mean, he was just always a good guy. In his career, never once did he ever have anything bad happen off the field. I mean, there was never a controversy with Joe involving anything about how he treated people. And that's a pretty good way, because when you do that as a leader, you develop trust. And when you develop trust, you develop the loyalty that you want. Right now, people are having a hard time recruiting and retaining people. Well, if you build a culture where you can make culture your competitive advantage and people want to stay, they want to be there, they want to be productive, that's how to build a successful, sustainable business.
We're talking with Joe Schmit, and you're a sports director, you're an author, you're a speaker, and spent a lot of time with some of the greatest, including the great Joe Mauer. And there is also a local connection there as well to us here in the Rochester area, as I know he came down and played at the AAA level a couple of times when he was hurt. So really cool that Minnesota was once, of course, not anymore, but was once affiliated with our Rochester Red Wings, for our local listeners here as well. Joe, how about some of the other athletes that you've covered who may have exemplified those same characteristics that you're talking about with Joe Mauer? Are there any other stories you'd like to share about some instances where you've noticed an athlete who's made a big difference, and how we can relate that to our young and emerging leaders?
Yeah, there's absolutely. There's all kinds of athletes and all kinds of coaches. It's interesting. I study the leadership part of it too, because that all goes into it. And when I was at KSTP, I have a show on Sunday nights, and I used to have Brian Billick on the show, and I used to have Tony Dungy on the show when they were both assistant coaches for the Minnesota Vikings. You could not have two polar opposite coaches. Tony never said a 4-letter word in his life. Billick can't get through a sentence without saying one. He was bombastic, he was loud, he's in your face. And Tony was just the opposite. Well, they both won Super Bowls. And it got me thinking, how did both these coaches, who are completely different people, win Super Bowls? And it was pretty obvious. It was the clarity that they had as leaders. Everybody knew their role on the team, why that role was important. And if you did the role, you were part of the team. And they were also able to get everybody to buy into that we're all in this together. And I shouldn't worry about somebody else on their role. I do my role, and that's what wins. So that's when I do a speech on culture, I break it down into 3 areas: compassion, connections, and clarity. And I think that they both really were crystal clear on what their values were, crystal clear on what your role was going to be and why it's important. You take that to the business world today, and especially with the younger generation, they don't just want to work for a paycheck every 2 weeks. They want to work for the greater good. What are you doing as a company, as an organization that is helping my community, our people? It's got to be something bigger. So in the case of athletics, it was the Super Bowl trophy. That's pretty big. But in the case of business, it's got to be, what are we really doing? How are we really putting people over profits? Because when you put people over profits, believe it or not, the byproduct becomes this wild success. The byproduct becomes going after that Super Bowl trophy.
Great thoughts there, Joe. And I got to delve a little deeper because ironically, I just spoke to a business about building a championship team culture. And I know you talked about those three ingredients. Can you delve a little bit deeper? Because I think as a young leader, you had a great point when you shared about, they get out of business school and they understand how to write a business plan and a profit and loss statement and so on. But can you delve in a little bit deeper because I know you speak to business as well, of what you've seen with successful businesses that have lasted because they built a team culture? What are they doing consistently?
Well, what I try to do when I work with a business is many businesses will have a core values. They'll have their 6 or 7 core values. The HR department comes up with it. They post it. They use it. And if you did a quiz for $1,000 and you had every employee say, name our 7 core values, you would still have $1,000 in your pocket when you're done because people would be guessing. So what you need to do is you need to develop a tenet, a mantra, a feeling in that organization that everybody understands, something that's memorable, something that's repeatable. And I think that whole idea comes from, we are putting people first. I care about you. I care about not only you as a professional worker, but I care about you as a human being too. So I cite a lot of examples of companies and organizations that have this awareness. And then when I work with a company, we try to come up with, a tagline, a line that works. I worked with one company where it took us a long time to get there, but they came up with, we're here to help everyone flourish. Flourish becomes their word. And it's repeatable. It's almost a joke because people will go around, are you flourishing today? Things like that. But everybody understands that feeling and that mantra that if I'm successful, you're successful, the business is successful, we're all going to rise because of it. And that builds that trust. Another organization I worked with did belong, because, and I think that gets into my connection area. Everybody needs to feel they belong somewhere in the organization, and that belonging is an important part of them being productive. And so how can you make that feeling that everybody belongs, and that there are so many people who are unengaged right now or disengaged right now in work, that how can you make them feel that what they do is important, because it is.
It's so well said, Joe. John, I know, has many questions as well, but I got to delve in on one thing, because you said a very important word that our friend and fellow speaking colleague, Dave Horsiger, studies to the end-all limit, and that is trust. And one of the things that I really push leaders is to develop an intentional trust plan. What have you found in the effective leaders you've talked to? How are they building trust with their team members?
Well, one is transparency. Obviously a leader can't be totally transparent on some things, but as transparent as you possibly can. So that is a communication thing. Secondly is make sure they know you care. It's as simple as that. And, in the old days, Jim, I can imagine as a coach, you've had many coaches who told you, don't get too close to your players, just, have them be a little fearful of you or whatever. That doesn't work anymore. The old yelling at the kid to scare the heck out of them. Fear is not a great way to lead. If you want to build trust, you have to be able to push your people a little bit. But at the same time, you have to be able to understand what makes them tick. I'm going to throw another name out at you, since you guys are both kind of sports guys. Bud Grant recently passed away. And about a year ago, I was doing an interview with Bud, and we were just sitting down afterwards, because I take advantage of when I get a brilliant mind to tap into it. And I said, Bud, what was your philosophy of leadership? Now, this was back in the days in the NFL where there really wasn't free agency. You had your team, and about the only way you could add to your team was in the draft. So a lot of these players played there for 5, 10, even 15 years. And he said, it was pretty simple. He said he got to know his players, and he got to know what made them tick. He goes, I knew I could not yell at Fran Tarkenton in front of everybody else. If Fran did something wrong, I had to take him behind a closed door. He said, Chuck Foreman, if I took Chuck behind a closed door, wouldn't do anything. Chuck, I had to yell at in front of the team. So he said, you learn what makes people tick, because one size does not fit all in leadership. And that was Bud's key to success. And I thought that totally translates to a manager managing their people, because there's some people that need a pat in the back every hour. There's some people that don't want to be recognized. You have to figure that out.
Hey, I just want to say one thing, and John, I'll let you get going with your question, but just for our audience, because I know some of them are not avid sports fans. Bud Grant was a legendary coach of the Minnesota Vikings, and Fran Tarkington was a Hall of Fame quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings. And Bud led it. Did they go to 4 Super Bowls with him as well?
Yeah, just like your Buffalo Bills, Jim.
Buffalo Bills. I'm pretty
Yeah,
sure we're the only 2 teams in the NFL have been there 4 times, but have not won it yet. But hopefully some. So go ahead, John.
Well, Joe, I'm curious because you're also a leader as well. You have gotten to know a lot of great leaders in the sports world, but at the TV station, you've also served as the sports director. So certainly you share leadership duties with other directors as well, but you're a leader of a team. And I think that's super important. And from the radio world, I understand a little bit how demanding the culture of TV can be, and that there's oftentimes conflict. And I would argue that conflict is necessary because to truly innovate, we need to have some different ideas. How, as a leader, do you handle conflict with your team?
Well, that's a great question. I think it starts with being blunt. Everybody knows, I kind of call myself a no BS guy, just because instead of talking to somebody on their review, when I have a review with everybody, they know exactly what I'm going to say because we've already talked about it. There's going to be no surprises there at all. And number 2, when we did a bunch of research and coming out of the pandemic, and one of the things we talked about was what's the difference between a good boss and a bad boss. And this one really struck me. A good boss is tough, but fair. And that equals trust. And the reason they're tough, they see some potential in you that you don't see in yourself. And I can even look back at myself earlier in my career when maybe I wasn't mature enough or smart enough to realize that I had to take this a little bit more seriously. And I had a couple of bosses that pushed me, that made me feel uncomfortable. And at first I kind of got ticked off. And later, as I look back, I realized they saw the potential in me that I didn't see in myself. And as a boss, if you can pull that off, you're going to build a great team. You're going to build a great team that is loyal. The team that when nobody is looking, they're going to stay the extra hour to get the job done. And that's what everybody wants. If people are punching the clock and 5 o'clock rings and you have 2 customers on the line who aren't satisfied and you leave, you don't have a very good team.
Yeah. And what kinds of impacts did those leaders who saw that potential in you early on, what kind of impact did they have through your journey?
Well, I think they pushed me to maybe get more serious about the business. They also made me realize that I did have this potential, and they made me see my weaknesses. One of my weaknesses, and it still is to this day, is to focus. I always say I'm like that dog that sees the squirrel. I go running off after that squirrel. So I have to make sure I let that squirrel go. But by recognizing what your weaknesses, I think that helps you grow. And quite frankly, we all want to grow and continually develop. And sometimes you need to make those mistakes. And sometimes you need that kick in the butt. And whether the boss takes you behind a closed door or yells at you in front of all the people, we all need that now and then to be reminded that we can push, we can go a little bit harder. We need to get a little uncomfortable sometimes. And too often, if you're kind of bored and you're kind of not pushing yourself, that means you're not trying hard enough.
Great point. Well, Joe, I'm curious because you've interviewed so many people, and I think one of the things I really push leaders is that they become more curious and ask better questions. So, because of your experience in asking in interviewing so many high-level people in the sports world and outside the sports world, could you share with our young and emerging leaders a few questions you found that have been very effective in to delve a little bit deeper and because you talked about getting to know your people. That's what Bud Grant did very, very well. Have you found a few questions that have helped with that?
Well, that is a good question, but I want to take it to another place first before I get to the questions.
Sure.
If you want to be a good leader, you have to be a good listener. And if you want to be a good interviewer in my business, and John in the radio business, you have to listen. And too many times when I see young reporters go into an interview with a list of questions, I say, throw that list away. I say, have an idea what you want to talk about, but listen to what they say and then follow up with what they said. Because somewhere in that interview, and I will tell you just a real quick story, and this is where I learned it. Because I mean, sometimes you have to look back when you made a mistake. What did you learn? This is going to age me like 1,000 years. But when I was in college, they had a radio show called Newsmakers, and they would bring in journalists. I went to the University of Wisconsin La Crosse. They'd bring in journalists from all the media outlets in La Crosse, and they would do this radio show. And they brought in a guy by the name of Rat Brown, who was a Martin Luther King friend and disciple. He was with Martin Luther King. So
Wow.
everybody is asking him kind of the cliche questions. What was the legacy of Martin Luther King or whatever? Anyway, I'm the dumb college kid sitting on there with all these professionals. And I said, I don't know why I said it. I said, do you think that James Earl Ray was the guy who killed Martin Luther King? Well, anyway, the guy went off and basically said there's a huge conspiracy, all this thing going on. My follow-up question was something stupid. The next journalist goes, I'm going back to that last question because I wasn't listening to what he said. I went down to my list and asked the next question. Well, so the next thing you knew, what was the headline in the paper for like nationally? I started a national story that this leader here following Dr. Martin Luther King thought there was a conspiracy on his murder. So anyway, so it was a pretty good lesson to learn. I was proud of myself for asking the question, not so happy I didn't do the follow-up. So listening is important. And I also tell people, you don't listen with your ears, you listen with your eyes. If you're not watching somebody, you're not listening. And you don't listen to respond, you listen to learn. And there's a big difference there. That's when you become an excellent listener. So I think the follow-up questions become part of the conversation. But I try to do it like, I'll do things like, what's the best thing that you did this weekend? That opens up a whole, it's just, okay, so somebody went fishing. Where'd you go fishing? I like the fish. Oh, we went up on Mille Lacs and we caught some water. Where'd you catch them? It's a commonality. It's something that all of a sudden we have something in common. If you're talking about the weather, you're not going deep enough. What do people like to talk about? They like to talk about themselves. My go-to question when I'm asking an athlete, like all of a sudden I've got a blank mind and they're not telling me anything, I'll say, describe yourself as an athlete. Well, I'm going to get 45 seconds or a minute of a soundbite because they're going to tell me all about themselves. And in the meantime, I can listen and get a follow-up out of that. So I think you need to dig a little deeper, dig a little bit more personal, make it about them, not about you. We all have friends who, the first half hour of the conversation, they talk about themselves. And then they say, hey, now that I'm done talking about me, why don't you talk about me for the next half hour?
Yeah. That's interesting, Joe. Also, since you're a speaker as well, so you do a lot of the talking, which is certainly important as a leader. But how do you listen even when you're the speaker? How do you make that a two-way conversation, even when really it's up to you to deliver a message?
Well, there's two things, and Jim will testify to this. You have to know your audience, and so I have a call right after this with an audience I have coming up, and I'm going to find out what their problems are. I'll use a question like, if I could wave a magic wand, what's the one problem we could solve in this event? And they will wave the magic wand. So all of a sudden you realize, what? They have a communication problem, or they have a trust issue, or they have a connection issue. So I can cater and pull in content that directly goes into that. And then secondly, when you're there, and I think this is where my, broadcasting is part of my DNA. I've done it my entire life. And You got to be able to ad lib, think on your feet, and change the script. If all of a sudden you find out something is working, change the direction, just go that way, go with it. If you had 5 minutes planned on maybe an exercise on connections and it's going really, really well, I'll go 10 minutes and steal the 5 minutes somewhere later. And that's where experience, you don't do that the first time you speak, as Jim will be able to tell you. But you do listen. I do a lot of interactive stuff, John, and I think that nowadays in the world, people just don't want somebody to go up and speak for an hour. They do want some interactive, so there's some tangible content that people can take out of that meeting and implement right away. And that's always one of my goals.
Well said. Joe, one of the questions I'd like to ask people, because you see this especially in the business world, but in your own industry as well. The example I like to share is the person that's very good as a salesperson, male or female, and they become so good that now they become the sales manager, which I kid people, sometimes they become the sales mangler instead, because there is a different skill set, and so, and I know you see this in your business where people get promoted into leadership positions. What would you tell that person getting into maybe their first real leadership position where they are working with a team of people to get them off to the right start? Because I know in my life, I became a head coach at 25 and I was out of that job at 26 because that's a question I ask. And that's one of the reasons I really wanted to do a podcast and help young emerging leaders, because I failed miserably in my first head job. So I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Well, first of all, as a professional speaker, we love that when that happens, because that's why they hire us, because somebody has screwed up. So keep on doing that. No, but I think it's a battle between humility and ego. So all of a sudden you have been promoted to this title, and all of a sudden you walk a little taller, you sit in a little bigger office, and you think you are the greatest of all time. So how can you be humble enough to ask for help? How can you be humble enough to get, a mentor, or get somebody to help you through the tough times? And the second thing that happens is, in many cases, the person that you worked next to and sold with, all of a sudden you are their boss. So I think, once again, being transparent there and talking about it, and there's an elephant in the room on that. How are we going to make this happen? And just being upfront and honest about it. But I think you all understand that there's the imposter syndrome out there, and I think that that's a little bit of the humble between the humble and ego. I remember one time I worked with a television anchor who was the number 2 anchor at the station, and desperately wanted to be the number 1 news anchor, and quite frankly was more talented and had more potential than the main anchor. And he couldn't wait to tell everybody how good he was. He'd meet a stranger on the street and said, "I'm better than this guy," whatever. And to the point, his ego was out of control. When he became the new anchor, you never heard from him again on that. And I realized it was self-esteem. It was whenever people have an issue like that, their self-esteem is bruised, and that's why their ego is showing. So whenever you see someone with a big ego, check their self-esteem.
Very good point. Yeah, absolutely. And Joe, you've worked with a lot of, I'm sure, young and emerging leaders in your sports department. Is there a story or two that you'd like to share about maybe a young leader that you've helped develop and certain qualities that you've seen in them grow over time under your leadership?
Well, and that's a good question. I would say that most of the young people that I think I've helped were probably more of the intern variety. There have been people who worked in the department that moved into a bigger, better job, and maybe they learned by osmosis. But the interns, I like to make sure they realize they can have fun on the job, but you work hard and you play hard. And then the second part of it is, this is what you need to do to take your game to the next level. You're now playing single A baseball. How are you going to get to double A? You got to learn to hit the curveball. In your case, you have to become a better writer. Let's work on becoming a better writer. Or in your case, you have to become a better presenter. Now you're in double A. How are you going to get to triple A? Okay. You're going to have to work on your defense. And maybe in that case, you're going to have to work on your presence on the air. You need a little more zip. You need a little more personality. How can you do that? So, I think that the people who want to take their next game the next level, they're easy. The ones who aren't sure, that makes it a little bit more difficult. So I say to emerging leaders, don't be afraid to tell me what you want. I've had many interns come in and they want my job. Eventually, that's what they want to do. And they're afraid to tell me that. And I'll say, do you want my job someday? Well, yeah, it'd be kind of, yeah. I said, good, tell me that so I can help you get there. I can help you. I can tell you what I did right, what I did wrong. And by the way, my trip to what I've done is going to be different than yours. Now, one size does not fit all here either. Just because I did it this way doesn't mean your journey has to go that way. However, there are some basics that you have to learn, and that would go back to the things that take you from single A to double A to triple A.
And as a leader, you also have to continually develop yourself as well. And I know you're a lifelong learner too, as an author and a speaker. How do you do that?
Well, I've been blessed because I was thinking about it the other day. My wife and I, somebody said, "Why are you guys so busy? You should be winding down at your age." And all of a sudden, I realized I like being busy. So I get bored easily. And I think I use what I got to get what I want. So by being bored easily, that makes me push myself. That makes me decide, you know what, let's take some chances. Let's do something different. This isn't working. Let's change the way we are. I always say I'm not a early adapter, but I'm a fast changer. So sometimes I'll see something happening and I'll say, I better pay attention to this. I'm going to go for it now.
Hey, Joe, another thing I think, young emerging leaders need, and you brought it up, so I want to delve a little deeper, is either hiring a coach or a mentor, or having a mentor, not necessarily that you would pay, but what advice would you give a young leader if they were actually to invest into a coach, or, even finding a mentor? What advice would you give them?
And that's a really good question. And I hope you don't mind. I'm going to drop another name. I'm sorry about this. Oprah told me I gotta quit name dropping. So, but here's what happens: is I'm lucky enough to interview and meet these people, and I'm a pretty good listener, and I'll listen to things, and they will have an impact on me. So I was at I did a speech for 3M, and it was around a senior golf tournament. And they asked me if I wanted to stay in golf after. And I said, golf? You bet. I was paired with Lee Trevino.
Oh,
so it was just an awesome experience. Well, Lee Trevino said something. Somehow we started talking about coaches. And Lee says, Joe, go walk. I said, okay, goes, that's your gait. No one's going to change that on you. He goes, we got all these golf coaches who haven't won the screen door open, trying to teach all these golfers on how to swing. Look at my swing. You can't coach that swing. That's me. It's like my walk. Now, you can coach me some of the things to go along with it, but use what you got to get what you want. And it kind of struck me because I think sometimes if you're going to hire a coach or a mentor, you don't want to hire, some person who's not successful, or you don't want to hire some person who, is only doing it for the money. We have some people in the speaking business who speak full time and coach on the side, and that's fine. But I always think, well, what are they really going to be concentrating on more? They're going to be concentrating more on their speaking. So do the research that you hire a good coach, somebody who's been there, somebody who's done it, and the investment is really the main thing. You have to realize that I might be investing some money. I'm going to be investing some time, but what am I going to get out of it? And I think if you pick the right coach, it always pays itself off, and then some.
Absolutely. And then how about mentorship? That's huge in leadership as well. And I'm sure it's similar to coaching, but what advice would you give potential mentees in looking for a mentor?
Yeah, once again, I think you pick the mentor you aspire to be. Would you, if you're in sales, would you hire a mentor who goes to happy hour every day at 3:00 and stumbles home at 7? No. Yeah, that wouldn't be the one you would want. You would pick the one who's driving the Ferrari because they work the extra. But I that money thing is a little bit out of it. But I think you look at somebody who has the values, somebody who has the work ethic, somebody who has the balance in life. We're all looking for that balance in life nowadays. It's pretty easy to make money, just work 20 hours a day, but are you going to ultimately be happy? No. Yeah. What is your balance that you can find in order to do it? I interviewed Dan Buettner, who wrote The Blue Zones, which is the people who live the longest in the world. He's from Minnesota. I admire Dan because the first time I met him, he was dating Cheryl Teagues. So, speaking of a great mentor, no, just. But he also did research for 1 year on the happiest people on the earth. And believe it or not, the happiest people on the earth are from Denmark. And they have a bunch of traits in this book you find out. So I followed up with the question. Here's the good question. So instead of asking what are all the traits that all the happy people in the world have, I said, you just spent a year researching the happiest people in the world. What did you change in your own life? And one of the things he changed in his own life, he only works 7 hours a day, 7 hours a day max. He goes, if I can't get it done in 7, I'm done. He goes, and a lot of times I like to work 4. But he came up with this idea that I use periodically in my speeches. He said, I designed myself an imaginary box. I call it my happiness box. And inside that box are all the values, the traits, and the things that are important to me. And inside that box, when somebody asks me to do something or I have to make a decision, if it fits in that box, the answer is easy. It's yes. If it fits outside that box, it's no. He goes, my life is so less complicated because it no longer fits in the box, and he sticks to it. And I think that too many times, many of us are pleasers, especially when you're younger, that you say yes when you should have said no. And I use that happiness box now. Yeah. I protect my time better than I used to, and because of that, I use that time to do other things, help my physical health. So it's that continual learning process, and you're going to still learn even when you're in your 60s.
Yeah. Well, Joe, my final question today is actually a two-part. Because I know through your journey and being now a great speaker is that one of the things I encourage leaders is to become better storytellers. So the 2 parts is, one, can you give our listeners a tip or two of how they can be more effective storytellers? And then the second part is, I had the pleasure to read both of your books, and I'd like you to share one other story, because you shared a great one about Joe Mauer and Silent Impact that you could share to kind of illustrate your point of why a couple points that maybe you have in becoming a better storyteller. Okay.
All right. I'm just writing that down because when you ask 2 questions, my mind can only handle one. It's interesting, Jim. In the speaking business, you have a choice whether to use slides or not use slides. I do not use slides because when I tell a story, I like people to paint the picture in their mind themselves. And I equate it to this. How many times have you read a book and then gone to the movie? And the book is better than the movie. You know why? Because in your mind, you painted that farm scene. You know what the lead character looks like. The producer and the director of the movie had a different idea. So paint a picture, get people involved in the story. And then seriously look at the words in the story. Where can you improve it by one word? Jerry Seinfeld. I read a story on Jerry Seinfeld. Before he goes out and tour, he does a lot of, he'll just show up at a stage and do some comedy. Jerry Seinfeld worked on one word, whether to use lifesavers or Jolly Ranchers in a joke. And he tried it 10 different times and found out that Jolly Ranchers was the much better descriptive term in this joke. So it's refining your craft, looking at your words, add some action verbs, and then produce it like a movie. It has to have a climax, and then at the end, make sure it has the moral of the story. So I will tell my quick story. I spoke to a conference of Wendy's franchisees, owners, and general managers. And after the conference, a general manager of a store came up to me and he goes, "Joe, I really liked your whole idea of this silent impact. And I really understand it. I want to tell you a story that happened in my Wendy's." He said every day an elderly gentleman would come through the drive-through window for breakfast. And every morning he was waited on by the same person. It was a woman who dropped her kids off at school early, trying to earn the family a few extra dollars, working the drive-through window at his restaurant. And he said, "I wish I had 100 of her because she was the best employee I ever had. When she said, 'Good morning, how you doing? Have a great day,' she meant every word. Every order that went out that window was absolutely perfect." I rarely get a woman like that when I go through a drive-through restaurant. Well, one day the old man who had been coming for breakfast for several months parked his car and walked in the restaurant. And he asked the general manager if he could see the woman who had been waiting on him for the last few months. And the GM said, "Sure." So off from behind the counter, the lady comes, the old man stands in front of her and he says, "May I give you a hug?" And she says, "Sure." And he gives her a big old burly bear hug and holds on a little tighter and a little longer than's comfortable. And he let her go and he said, "I just came here to thank you today. I'm not going to be seeing you as much anymore. You see, every morning when I came in here for breakfast, I was on the way to the hospital to see my wife. And she went to the good Lord last night. But every day when I came in here, you reminded me of her. Nobody ever left a conversation with my wife without feeling better about themselves." We make our biggest impressions when we're not trying to be impressive. And sometimes the little things really do turn out to be the big things. And that's why we all need to be more aware and intentional with the impact that we have. Now,
beautiful. Thanks, Joe.
So that's kind of the arc of the story. I've worked on that story a long time, using words, a big old burly bear hug. What does that put in your mind? The old man, you're thinking of this old man driving a Buick, right? So in your mind, you're processing that. And then, so I end the story with here's why it happened. And here's what we all need to do. So that's just one little story, but I think that, and I think the other thing, quite frankly, is every time I tell the story, it feels like I'm telling it for the first time.
Okay.
So,
Yo, John, you got a final question, or just want to hit Joe up on his contact? And then after you're done, I'd like to keep the recording on, just to ask Joe a quick question.
Sure. Yeah, if Joe has a moment, because I know that time here is short, but real quick, Silent Impact, The Impact Blueprint, both of your books available on Amazon and wherever books are sold, as well as joeschmit.com, another way to get in touch with Joe and connect, especially if you would want him to speak with your organization. Joe, is there any other way that our listeners can learn more about you or get in touch?
No, and it's Joe Schmit. It's SCHMIT, no D, one T. That's my website. I just appreciate the opportunity to talk and spread the message. And if we can connect with one person is great. I want to show you something here real quick, if I can. So this Joe Mauer story, I don't know how this is going to work. So the Joe Mauer story, a charity started because of the Joe Mauer story. It's called Thumbs Up for Mental Health. Wow. And anyway, Joe and I decided to write a book, and this is going to be too big. I'm not going to be able to pull back far enough. Shoot, I should practice that. But anyway, we wrote a book called The Right Thing to Do, and it's a children's book. And because when I asked Joe, I said, why did you do it? He said, because what's the right thing to do? And 100% of the proceeds are going to go to 2 charities, including this charity on mental health for kids that started based on after reading the story about Joe Mauer.
Wow, that's awesome.
It'll be coming out in 2024. So
we look forward to that. In the meantime, the links to your books and your website down in the show notes. And we look forward to that collaboration with you and Joe Mauer. That is all about making an impact. And I know that's what you are all about, Joe. So thank you so much for your time today with us.
You guys are awesome. I appreciate it.